It's no secret that stolen data ends up on the dark web, but how does it get there and who are the parties involved? For Tech Republic and ZDNet, my name is Dan Patterson with Terbium Chief Research Officer Munish Walther-Puri. And today we're talking about the supply chain of stolen data. Munish, thank you very much for your time today. Let's start with the incident. When a data breach occurs and sensitive data, whether it's PII or intellectual property or anything else, is exfiltrated from an enterprise company site or even an SMB or in a startup, who takes that data and then where does it go? What is the transit path?
So that's a good question. The first thing I would say is there's a few pathways, and some of them are quite hidden and narrow, and some of them are relatively more visible. And so there's multiple pathways that information can take into the hands of cyber criminals. So a few of those pathways involve transit through the dark web. And when there's a breach of some kind, or let's say there's some PII stolen, depending on how recently it's happened and the size and the number of records and the intent of the attacker, it may not make it onto open forums on the dark web or forums on the dark web immediately. It might take some time because that is precious, and data on the dark web is valued in many ways by its scarcity and the freshness of it. Payment card data is a different story altogether, and that, regardless of where it comes from, finds its way onto the underground economy on the dark web relatively quickly and relatively actively.
So how is this, let's take credit card, stolen credit card data. How is that packaged and resold, even marketed? Is it the actor, the threat actor, the villain who steals this that then packages it and puts it up for sale? Tell me about the mechanics.
Sure. So I'm glad you're asking about it in that way, because I think that there's a few different players, and I would never aggrandize cyber criminals. I think it's important to think of them as entrepreneurs and business people, because that's how they're running their carding markets and their online e-commerce sites. Is they look at stolen data as a good, and they operate with lots of the same principles and ideas that legal conventional e-commerce does. So what does that mean? They focus on marketing, customer service, advertising, having a consistency of supply. So a number of things that you wouldn't think that a cyber criminal would focus on, they definitely think about. And they use analytics to look at the activity and which kinds of cards are being sold where. And it's pretty mature and fairly sophisticated.
Who are the various actors in this supply chain? Obviously, when I think about the mechanics of what you just explained, marketing and metrics, I can think of legitimate professions that do that and do it really well. Are these criminals recruiting, say, experts in analytics? Are they trying to flip and turn normal people who have good skills? I mean, this is really 101, but help us understand beyond just organized crime, who is performing these actions and how do they get these skills?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we try and focus on is how that data moves along. So understanding the who is important for us in two ways. One, that there aren't a totally unique set of skills for maintaining, like you said, analytics, metrics, those kinds of things. So on the dark web, it's also a community where people can network and find the resources that they need and connect with each other, and find someone who has those skill sets. Some of the more specialized aspects of cybercrime and fraud, there not only are actors on the dark web that have those capabilities. There are services out there that provide tutorials and explain how to perpetrate certain kinds of fraud, and in some cases will provide that fraud as a service.
Fraud as that's a fascinating emerging business. What about law enforcement? Where do they come in? How are they investigating dark web channels? We know the FBI is there, but what other alphabet soup agencies are involved with dark web tracking?
Yeah, so that's where the who starts to become really important, because they're trying to map out the networks, and as you probably know, and your viewers and otherwise know, attribution is difficult on the dark web. There's, in some cases, anonymity, in other cases, pseudonymity. And so attribution is pretty difficult. So that's definitely law enforcement's challenge. At the same time, they have deep embedded resources that have been there for a while, and they have the writ to investigate and try and take down some of these operations. So to that end, you mentioned the FBI. Definitely anyone that's dealing with the opioid crisis, because there's a fair amount of that activity on the dark web. So, Drug Enforcement Agency, and then we also see a number of other kinds of security concerns that Homeland Security would be involved as well, and then in some cases local police. Local police are involved, especially if their jurisdiction is a hotbed of drug activity or fraud, anything where they're stealing cards en masse. We continue to see arrests happen where someone's trafficking in drugs on the dark web, and at some point they have to go pick those up, right? Or if there's other physical goods, they have to go pick those up. What's dangerous, what's challenging for law enforcement is where a transaction is completely digital. There's no physical good. There's no paper trail. That's where we see the challenge around stolen data.
So what do I do if I'm a business, if I'm a consumer, and I want to not just prevent my own data from being stolen, but understand more about the economy so I can enact preventative measures that are systemic?
Good questions. I say questions because I think there's two in there. What does a business do? What does a consumer do? So let's start with businesses. Businesses, the first thing is not going to be very surprising. Understand their risk profile. So the dark web provides a number of risks, and I think for a lot of people, it's a scary, spooky place where they don't know very much of what's happening. They think it's a Craigslist for hitmen or a meetup for terrorists. And there's a lot more that happens there that has an impact on business operations, particularly around data and security of assets. So the first thing is to understand a risk profile and to take a risk-based approach. We think that's the most effective way to allocate your resources, and then determine if your security controls are being effective. If you believe that sensitive data is not getting out there, you need to go test that notion and understand what that exposure looks like. So that's, I think, the very first step, is to understand that risk profile and then, understanding controls. For consumers, it's definitely challenging. The two things I will say, not first. So not be motivated by fear. Fear is not a good way to push someone towards action. You can use fear to get me to join a gym. You can't use fear to get me to go to the gym. We need people to go to the gym. So that's about similarly understanding their risk, but really understanding their own profile and their own data. And I think people are starting to understand that their data is worth something. So that's the first thing I'd say to consumers is value, to have some data self-worth. Your data is worth something. And the second is to take some basic preventative measures. Those two aspects, I think many people have talked about them. I will only encourage them as well, to use a password manager and to use multi-factor authentication. But a good place to start is a password manager.